Hi, this is Bob from Hobby Concepts. Today I want to talk about these photo etched parts I've added on this tank. I'm going to do a little video on bending and soldering photo etch. So let's get started.
I wanted to do a little video on just photo etch, folding and soldering photo etch. So I've got a piece of photo etch here. This happens to be front fenders for a Tamiya 1/16 Tiger tank. And since it's going to be an operating model, gluing these together is not an option. They just aren't strong enough. So I'm going to solder. Now, a couple tools I use. The first one is this photo etch bending tool. This one is by the Small Shop. I'll put a link in the description to where you can buy it. Basically, it clamps photo etch, and then you use this piece to bend it. You can reverse this plate so that you can use these fingers. There's all kinds of things that you can shove photo etch in to bend it into certain shapes. And a lot of times I use a razor blade to fold. So I'm going to be using that. You'll see that in action. For soldering, I use this MG Chemicals rosin flux, and you will need flux to solder photo etch. You cannot really do it without it, and I'm going to show you how that works. I just got some plain Kester solder here. Pretty much anything works. And then some assorted tools, tweezers, a very sharp X-Acto knife, assorted files. And here's a piece of photo etch that I just did. This is a rear fender for the same Tiger. You can see that it's soldered in the joints, soldered underneath. Very strong. Will hold up just fine on this RC model. So I'll get started and solder some photo etch. Oh, the other thing you need, obviously, soldering iron. I use a Weller WLC 100 soldering iron. It's kind of been my standby for years. And various soldering tips. I'm using a pointed soldering tip here on this. So, okay, I'll show you how we do this. Okay, to cut this out, I use a hard surface. I don't like using a mat because it's too soft. I just use a sharp X-Acto knife blade, cut the traces. The soft surface, what happens is sometimes the photo etch bends, especially small pieces. So I'll just cut this out. Okay. One trace I missed there. Okay, so there's a front fender. I'm going to go ahead and cut out all the other pieces that I have to bend and show you just some of the bending process. I'll just show a quick example of folding here. So I've got a 90-degree bend in this, and I just loosen these knobs up, tuck it under to the fold line, and then tighten it down. I honestly don't know how you would do photo etch well without a bending tool. And the cool thing about this tool, it has a spring that lifts up the plate. So when you loosen it, it just automatically lifts. Okay, I've got that clamped in there. I know it's small, so we'll just use a razor blade here. We'll slide it underneath. Do one here. And I'm going to use this has got a sharp edge on it too. Slide it underneath there. And bend it up 90 degrees. Okay, loosen that. Now I've got a 90-degree bend in my part. It folds right here. And then that part is going to solder onto the plate like this. So now we're going to do the soldering. I'll solder a couple pieces here and just show you how to do that. Earlier I mentioned this rosin flux. What I've done is I've poured some of that into a small applicator bottle. I'll put a link to these bottles in my description too. They're pretty handy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a drop of the flux on here, and I'm going to just spread it on this scrap piece of Photoetch here. And I'll show you why here in a second. So I'll take a soldering iron, solder on it, and I'll put it where there's no flux. I'm trying to heat it. Okay, I got a little solder on there. But you see how it balls up? So now, let's put a little solder on here where the flux is. And with the flux, look at the solder. I can flow it out and basically cover that whole area with one drop of solder. It goes wherever the flux was. So you can see here I get a blop, which is no flux, then I've got a nice smooth solder, well, it's not a joint, but a run of solder here. So that's the idea of the flux. Wherever you put the flux, the solder just sucks in there. So now let's actually solder a piece and see what that looks like. My first part to solder is this little frame right here. So what I'm going to do is put a little flux on here. Right down there. We'll do the same thing on the bottom of this. Get a good coating of flux there. And that will suck in just fine. Now, I'm going to need to clamp this, I think, to get it straight. So I'll clamp that and we'll come back and solder it. Notice also I'm using a piece of wood here so it doesn't melt my mat. Okay, I've got this piece clamped. Now, yes, they're plastic clamps, but we're not going to be long enough to melt them. So what I have to do is I have to heat the work here. And there goes the solder. And it's going to suck right underneath. So I can take the clamps off. The solder sucked under there nicely. The part's in the right place. So I'm going to now add some flux underneath this edge and then finish the soldering. So I added flux underneath here. Now I can just finish my soldering. Once I get this heated up, the flux will just suck it underneath. Solder here. See, you just need a little tiny bit of solder and you can really just pull it right in there. I'll clean this up with a file afterwards. Okay, we've got our nice 90-degree corner here. Finish up this piece right here. pulled up a little bit, so I'm going to just heat this work, melt the solder underneath. There we go. And I'll just clean this up with a file. And that is how I solder Photoetch. I'm going to solder a few more of these up and then I'll show you what it looks like when I get it done. Got my fender all finished. You can see, well, I hope you can see how the solder sucked under all these parts nicely. Built this little frame here and soldered it together. I also built these little hinges and soldered them on. Nice thing about soldering is you can always heat the work up again and take it apart. The hinges don't work. I soldered this solid because, again, this is going to be on an operating model. It's very strong, so I wanted it that way. One final thing to do is I take a little rubbing alcohol, Q-tip, and clean up any remaining bits of flux, because paint doesn't stick to it well. So that is soldering Photoetch. I will put links to the flux, to the little bottles, to the solder, to the soldering iron, to the tips in my description, so if you want to see any of these products you can just go there and click on the links. These are going on a radio controlled Tamiya Tiger 1 tank 16th scale. If you want to see how I'm going to use them, I'm doing a video series on building that tank, so you can check that out. I appreciate you watching. Thank you very much, and I appreciate it if you subscribe.